Thank you, James, for inviting me for this. When I initially saw the call for papers, I was not sure if I could apply because even though my research is not particularly looking into decolonization, but my research practice and the way I teach inevitably has been decolonized. So James thought, okay, I should still send in something, and well, here I am. So today, like James said, my presentation is on decolonizing film education, integrating global perspectives and practices. So the outline, this is, oops, sorry. So the outline for today's presentation is that first I will talk about how we draw from our lived experiences and research to develop a curriculum that is truly decolonized. And then I will share some examples of how I borrow from my own research to ensure that my teaching practice is also decolonized, and lastly, some of the challenges that I have faced, and also something to discuss with all of you as well as to how we can work together to counter those challenges. So just to give you a background about myself, I am originally from India, where I studied journalism and media and communications. And before I made the shift to culture and creative industries, my theoretical background was very much literary theory, cultural studies, post-structuralism. So your Barth, your Michel, de Certeau, all of that is what we studied in my Indian universities. But I think it is also important to note that, yes, while I did study Barth, but at the same time, because you're also I was surrounded by Bollywood and Indian film industry. So I was consuming both, the French New Wave cinema, but also Bollywood commercial cinema and other Indian regional films as well. So when I first moved to the Netherlands to do my MA and to Australia to do my PhD, something that really would frustrate me is that whatever I'm reading, I would be like, I'm not sure it applies back home. What the experiences that I had in India and what I had seen, of course, what I was reading from the Western scholars, it existed, but it did not particularly apply to back home. And that was something that really, really frustrated me, even when I was doing my doctoral research. So, which is why I've highlighted this, that before I even knew what decolonization meant, I felt it. In fact, I did not hear about this word until I had moved to the UK. And I feel like, yes, in some ways it has also become a buzzword too. But I realized that I was already kind of, in my teaching, in my research, I was already decolonizing it without realizing that I was doing that. So to give everyone a sense of my research practice and where I'm coming from when I'm teaching, so my doctoral research was on Bollywood, or the Hindi film industry of India, as a cultural industry and soft power. And my current research is investigating the intermediary role of digital platforms in balancing the asymmetrical flow of cultural content between Western and non-Western countries, while also addressing the pressures of platform imperialism. In fact, soon enough, I'll be going to India to do my fieldwork to interview K-drama fans. I'm doing a comparative analysis of UK and India. And I thought it would also be useful to give you an overview of the modules that I've taught across Australia and the UK to demonstrate where it is that I'm able to bring my insights from my research. So very briefly, you have cultural policy and creative industries, global media industries, film, media and visual communication, media economics and regulation, and globalization and identity. And so I'll start with the decolonization in my teaching bit. So the first thing when it comes to decolonization while teaching for me is what I call the framework of thinking, or a more fancy research term which students have trouble understanding is the epistemology. And my starting point is actually this book by Samia Khatoon, which is called Australia Nama, which I happened to read during my doctoral research. It was particularly at a time when I was really struggling with, coming across so much studies on culture and creative industries, but wondering how does it fit in the Indian scenario. And bear with me while I give the context to this book, and why it helped me is because, so Samia Khatun, if I'm not wrong, she actually teaches us SOAS. Her book is on this Bengali Sufi book, which was discovered in an Australian outback city, Broken Hill. It was discovered in a mosque over there, and it was actually mislabeled as a Quran by the settlers or the white scholars. And it took years later, Samia Khatun came across that book and was like, wait, this is written in Bengali. It seems like a poetry book. Why was this mislabeled as the Quran? And what happened is that the book leads Samia Khatun to discover histories of immigration of South Asians in Australia and their interactions with the Aboriginal communities in Australia, something that has actually not been noted, that South Asian immigrants and Aboriginal communities have had a history of not just, of course, in terms of trade, communicating with each other, but also marrying, having children, etc., that is not extensively documented. And these histories she learned while she tried to brush up her own command over her mother tongue, which is Bengali, but also spending time with the Aboriginal communities, trying to understand their oral storytelling, where she tried to understand how is it that the oral storytelling contains keys to interpret knowledge and the knowledge that they contain, which we often do not have access to. And I think, like you mentioned in yours as well, like your collaborator Mike, he learned that language. He became really embedded in that culture. And I think that's really important when you become embedded, when you try to understand the language and the framework. But this is what I call the framework of thinking. And via her book, Khatun is challenging and critiquing the monolingual approach often adopted by Western scholars when studying a work outside of their country, language, and culture. Of course, the other bit is, I know a lot of us, we naturally tend to speak a lot of languages. Maybe we are bilingual or trilingual, and that is a strength because language is also how we perceive the world. And it is important that we hold on to those languages because the framework that they provide us with leads us to interpretations and epistemologies that perhaps English language might not lead to. So my mother tongue is Bengali, but I also speak Hindi. So often for my own research, I would look into media reports which have been published in Hindi, just to kind of get a sense of the industrial structure of the Bollywood over the past decades. This is something that in English language that would not have been captured. And of course, I'm not saying that all of us should try to learn different languages. I don't think that would be possible. But I think what we should try to understand is that dismantling the dominance of English language or Eurocentric framework is important, and that we bring in different frameworks into prominence as well. And this particular line that I picked up from her book, the storytelling strategies and interpretive keys contained in non-English language texts. So when I do have international students in my class, I always tell them, hold on to their languages, because I think often what happens is they come here, they will change their names, maybe to an English sounding names. And I'm like, no, don't do that. Of course, it's up to them if they don't feel comfortable. But at the same time, I tell them just because you've come to an English speaking world does not mean your language does not hold importance. You bring in knowledge and understanding that I'm not aware of, and it is something to be shared. In fact, as part of that, when I was in Australia, I was trying to learn Mandarin because most of my international students were from China. That didn't go that well because it's a really tough language. But the thing is, at least it did help me to connect with the students, and they opened up a lot more. So now, using Khatun's book as a signpost for myself, when I am teaching about Bollywood films and industry, I always urge the students to approach it with a completely blank slate and to try and understand, for example, why is it that Indian films have songs and dance. Often, I encounter these assumptions that, oh, it's just songs and dance, or it's just musicals. And well, Indian cinema is not musical. It's again a mislabeling. They're not musicals. But then I asked them that, have you wondered why is it that those films have songs and dance? What is the purpose behind it? And the thing is, if you look at the history of Indian cinema, when initially, even before India gained independence in 1947, when filmmakers were trying to make films, so if I'm a producer, filmmaker, if I want an audience, which is, at that time it was a new medium, if I want to attract an audience, they are going to get attracted to something that they're most familiar with. And what happened is that time the filmmakers, they borrowed tropes from local theater, puppetry, oral storytelling. A lot of the colors and a lot of the melodrama and the emotions that come in Indian cinema is because of local theater, and there's a history to it. If you look into the local theater and dance, etc., you will see that Indian films tend to borrow from them the tropes, the storytelling tropes. And that is something important to understand, which is why, since I have grown up watching Indian films, for me it's not jarring when I see suddenly the actors are singing and dancing in another country. Of course, it's jarring if you're not used to that kind of visual language, but for me it's not, because I've grown up with that kind of storytelling. And it's not just in films, but it's also through stories and fables that my parents have told me, which are grounded a lot in Hindu mythology. So once I explain to them that this is the root of it, which will help you to understand why Indian cinema does have song and dance and why it is so important. And given the fact that even now, the India's population is so large, so the domestic audience is always the focus. So obviously, any kind of producer, filmmaker, when they're making the films, their primary focus, especially the more commercial ones, is going to be, yes, very commercial, the masala, that term that they use, it is going to be masala. But at the same time, the other thing I tell them, the industrial structure, I think we mentioned the industrial structure in the Q&A, is that for the longest time, the Indian film industry was not recognized by the Indian government. It was part of the informal sector, which is why a lot of the funding came from the underworld. A lot of the funding was black money, which also had an impact on the kind of films that were being produced and how they were being, distributed. So that's again that context that I try to explain to the students, that you need to look into it, not just as a text, but where it is coming from, and be aware of that particular country's history. And then what I try to explain them is that this point, the second one, is to view Indian cinema or any kind of cinema that they watch from another part of the world just as different kinds of visual language, and that one is not superior to the other. We have this tendency, of course, because when we're learning films or film theory, that okay, you have the Italian neorealism, the French New Wave, it's more stylistic, more aesthetic, more superior, etc. And I think even for students to change that kind of thinking is hard. It's not that easy, because for a lot of us, like I have grown up watching Hollywood films, Indian films, and different kind of films. But if I'm teaching, say, students, even when I was in Australia, who are domestic students, or even here, they don't necessarily grow up watching different kinds of films. Probably the most of their consumption is English language films, which is why when they grow up, I think when they look at Asian cinema generally, it's usually with the kind of, what kind of film is that? And hopefully I try to change that point of view. I'm not sure if I succeed, but at least this is how I try to tell them that this is what you should be thinking. The other thing is that I tell them to think about their own personal heritage, history, and to own it, and to use that to critically analyze what they are studying, because we do have extremely diverse classrooms as well, which have histories of immigration, colonialism. The other very important thing, at least according to me, is that decolonizing our own minds. Because again, we are, when we are growing up, the kind of texts that we are learning, they're still very Eurocentric. And we often don't realize that we are using that same kind of framework to determine what is aesthetic, what is not, what is right, what is wrong. So I try to tell them to not assume that anything that stems from the West are the best practices. And just to give an example on when I'm teaching on digital platforms, because I think the assumption tends to be, oh, Netflix is the biggest thing. It has changed how audience view things. Yes, it has. It has changed distribution as well. But when I give them the example that Netflix has actually failed in India, it has been really, really struggling. And I doubt that Netflix will actually ever do well in India. And when I tell them, a lot of the students are really, really surprised. They're like, how come? Because, I think they tend to, it's not their fault as well. I think our assumption is that these big digital platforms, which are primarily US based, are dominant everywhere. But giving them the example of India really helps them to rethink that, okay, perhaps Netflix is not big everywhere. And in fact, it's a very good example of not only shattering the illusion of Netflix as a dominant player, but that the domestic streaming market in India has to an extent resisted the platform imperialistic forces of US-based digital platforms. And related to the digital platforms, some of the class activities in trying to make them understand, to look at different examples is that, say, if it's on digital platforms, I will divide the students into groups and ask them, okay, choose a country of your choice, which is not an English-speaking country, and look at the market of the digital platforms there. Who are the dominant players? Try to think of, okay, if it's a local streaming service, why do you think that is dominant in that particular market? And I also tend to give maybe statistics like this, because once they have this data in front of them, it also gives them an actual sense of, okay, perhaps Microsoft is not big in Asia. Just because I think our thinking is such, generally speaking, that once we have some kind of numbers or visualization, it tends to give them a sense of, okay, the media landscape is not the same everywhere. Or the other example, because for master's students, I tend to teach them cultural policy, and cultural policy and culture are so intertwined. And in many countries which have experienced colonialism, culture is really, really important to them, and cultural policy. So again, what I ask them is, choose your own country, look at how they define culture. What do they think is important when they're formulating their cultural policy? What comes under what is culture and not? It's a lot of it is because of the colonial experiences, and that's where I discuss post-colonialism as well with the students. And again, for them, it's a very thoughtful exercise, because then what I ask them is, okay, fine, we have all the countries, let's put them up. See how they're defining the culture. Why do you think that's the case? When it comes to the reading list, and I know we have discussed a bit about this, something that helps me to think of how to kind of approach my reading list when I'm prescribing the readings is that, what if an Australian or UK film scholar or a student, in addition to reading about Andre Bazin and David Bordwell, also reads the works of Indian film scholars like Chidananda Dasgupta and Madhav Prasad. The idea is that both Western and non-Western scholars are being read in an equal footing. And again, I think that's hard work. Often students don't realize it, that I think they automatically also tend towards white scholars. I think that happens with us as well. But very intentionally doing it, at least in some way, helps students to become familiar with non-Western scholars and get used to the fact that, okay, I'm not just reading white scholars, but I'm reading scholarly work from different parts of the world. So this is just an example. I think James mentioned earlier in his initial talk about one way of looking at things. I try not to give non-Western examples as case studies or anomalies. No, I think we need to move away from that. I've already mentioned the second point about students becoming used to seeing non-Western names, often names that could be from their own heritage and culture. And that's again something that students, I think some of them do appreciate that. I've had some of the feedback that, sometimes seeing that name, similar names, they're like, oh, okay, a lot of work has taken place in that context by someone from my own heritage. The third very important point is including work from peers as part of the reading list. I think a lot of us right now are working on decolonization or any kind of similar research, like in my area, it's creative economy or soft power. And if I know some colleague of mine has published a work and if it's related, I do put that in the reading list. Not just that, if they're based in the UK, I try to get them in as guest lectures as well. If the funding is there, I try to do that. Or something that in the last term within my department we did is, for really good reason, our department is one of the really diverse ones. What we did is we kind of did an exchange lecture with others, wherein I would go to my colleagues' lecture and give one lecture, and then my colleague came to my lecture. So because even within our universities, we have so much diversity, like diversity of research that's taking place, we can use that too. The challenges, the big one is that often what happens is that, at least in my field, culture and creative industry studies on and from India are not as widespread. So actually finding studies on it, scholarly work. There are reports, which are often published by accounting firms, but I can't always use that, when students have to write essays. And for early career researchers, again, publication takes time. It could be work is happening, but then publication, obviously, all of us know it takes time. As scholars from Global South, we need to adopt the language of Western academia to be significant. And again, I think when we adopt that kind of language, again, some kind of nuance and that framework is getting lost, because I think sometimes we have to kind of play those cards well to be significant. Work published in non-English languages is not always easily accessible or translatable. All of us don't know all the languages. We might not have access, etc. And the very last one, which I think is very important, I think we have touched upon this, is accountability and taking responsibility of our own privilege and prejudices. Something that I always tell my students about myself is that even though I'm oppressed here, in India, I come from a privileged caste. So I do come from caste privilege from my home country, which means the kind of knowledge that I'm also giving is subjective. I do not have access to a host of other scholarly work, or just not scholarly work, but a lot of literature that is not in my language and is actually from lower caste. A lot of those work, either I don't have the network or the access, and that does come from my caste privilege. So I do also foreground it to the students that I'm also coming from a point of privilege. So that's something to be mindful of. And I think this can be done for the discussion bit. Thank you, everyone. And I think I'm done.